The contemporary reading this morning is from Rebecca Solnit's book, Men Explain Things to Me. Recently, a lot of Americans have swapped the awkward phrase same-sex marriage for the term marriage equality. The phrase is ordinarily employed to mean that same-sex couples have the rights different-sexed couples do. But it could also mean that marriage is between equals. That's not what traditional marriage was. Throughout much of its history in the West, laws defining marriage made the husband essentially an owner and the wife his possession. Women's liberation has often been portrayed as a movement intent on encroaching upon or taking power away from men, as though in some dismal zero-sum game, only one gender at a time could be free and powerful. But we are free together or slaves together. Well, I'm sure you're wondering what in the world that has to do with the epistle lesson this morning. But let me explain, if I may. When Scott asked me to speak some Sunday during his sabbatical, I picked July 5th. Mostly, I'll admit, because I thought, who in their right mind will be in church on July 5th? The day after Independence Day. And it also gave me a lot of time to prepare. So, as I prepared, I reviewed the lectionary text for that Sunday and realized the epistle lesson was Paul's letter to the Ephesians. You know, the one where he exhorts slaves to obey their masters and wives to obey their husbands. At least that was the extent of my familiarity with it when I was complaining to my son that I'm not sure I really like this text. So, being the brilliant son that he is, he said, well, why don't you talk about that? And I thought, yes, I could talk about the struggle to be an independent woman, and coming the day after Independence Day, it seemed like a great idea. But when Scott and Michael got word of Sebastian being born, my due date got moved up. No matter, Scott said, talk about it anyway. So I am. I started my business more than 30 years ago, and for some reason, I was frequently interviewed by reporters who were interested in knowing whether I had a hard time being taken seriously as a woman running a business. And of course, I always said no. There's no difference that I can tell. But that really was not the truth. In fact, just a few months after we started, I was at lunch with a colleague and a media rep, and all at once the media rep turned to us and said, so do you girls usually take Fridays off to go shopping? Of course, I was a little taken aback, but I learned early on in business that calling people on thoughtless assertions doesn't really get you anywhere. That's why I lied in the newspaper interviews. But the truth is that it's tricky, knowing when to speak up and when to just let things go, trying hard not to make others feel stupid, but at the same time trying to keep some self-respect and confidence. You know, turning every conversation into a negotiation is exhausting, and it's just plain obnoxious. I don't think I ever had the energy for it, and I know I don't now. But this summer, I read Rebecca Solnit's book, Men Explain Things to Me, and I'm not sure whether it was more amusing or upsetting, but it helped me crystallize this conundrum about when women should assert themselves and when they need to stay quiet. The book starts out with Rebecca talking about going to a party with a friend who was hosted by a man whom she describes as an imposing man. And he asked her what she did. Her friend started answering for her, saying she was an author who had just completed a biography of Edward Muybridge. Before she could get much more out, the man interrupted and said, oh, well, let me tell you about this really important book that's just been written about Muybridge. As he went on, it became clear he was talking about her book and that he had not read it. It's an amusing story, like someone asking you if you generally take Fridays off to shop, but it does have more serious implications. Solnit calls it the slippery slope of silencings. Yes, she says, people of both genders pop up at events to hold forth on irrelevant things and conspiracy theories, but the out-and-out confrontational confidence is, in my experience, gendered. Men explain things to me and other women, whether or not they know what they're talking about. at least some men. Every woman knows what I'm talking about. It's the presumption that makes it hard at times for any woman in any field, that keeps women from speaking up and from being heard when they do, that crushes young women into silence by indicating, the way harassment on the street does, that this is not their world. It trains us in self-doubt and self-limitation. Now, maybe that seems a little bit overstated. Not every disagreement is such an obnoxious assertion of confidence and power that it leaves one with a choice between feeling inadequate or becoming obnoxious herself. Neither of them good alternatives. But it's tricky. Sometimes you hear intent that's not there, and more often for me, who my son will tell you is oblivious to most things, you miss intent totally. Finding just the right way to respond to thoughtless assertions and confrontation without asserting or losing oneself is tricky, and I have often gotten it wrong. So, what is an independent woman? I've gotten my answers largely from women in this church. When I first became moderator, we were going through changes at First Central, and I called all the past moderators together. As we were gathering, I overheard Sam Pfeiffer and Fred Wupper having a side conversation, talking about adjusting to retirement. Sam said, "I thought things were going really well and we were having fun until one morning I said to Jenny, 'Well, what are we going to do today?' And Jenny said, 'What is this we stuff? I have things to do.' You need to find your things." Jenny Pfeiffer is an independent woman. Marilee Jensen frequently would talk to me about business after church, and one day she told me that she longed to travel, and she was tired of waiting for her husband Stan to agree that he wanted to go with her, so she signed up for a trip by herself. It struck me as very independent. I asked her later how it went. She said she had a wonderful time. Marilee Jensen is an independent woman. I frequently told Deb Kerwin I think of her as fearless, and I admire how she graciously but insistently led us to consider more inclusive images of God. There are so many, and of course, there was Eleanor Swanson, a woman I considered a mentor. Eleanor started her career as a school teacher and then decided to go back to the University of Nebraska to get her master's in education. She was told by the dean of the School of Education, "Well, you can get your master's, but you will never be allowed to go into school administration." So she went to law school, where she led the University of Nebraska moot court team to their first national win, and then became the first woman admitted to the bar in the state of Nebraska. She was also the first woman moderator at First Central. I so wish young women here today could have known her. She was unapologetic about her intellectual strength and courage, while also taking outright joy in debate and discussion. She was forthright and strong in her convictions, but fueled by an eager and vivacious curiosity and interest in others and their views. Here are some things I learned from Eleanor about church governance, which along the way became life lessons for me. Number one, just because someone isn't saying something in a meeting doesn't mean they don't have something to say. I would watch how she watched others. She had a great way of knowing when someone wanted to say something, and she would call on them to encourage them to speak their minds. Number two, she had a great way of making people feel affirmed and reinforced when they expressed their opinions, even when she disagreed with them. I thought that took a lot of strength and confidence not to be threatened by other opinions, some of them expressed very strongly. In fact, she was open to them. From confidence comes grace, I believe. Number three, she had a deep and abiding love and respect for our polity at the UCC. You know, our church has a heritage of strong congregations. Here, the members not only have the right to express their views and enact policies, but we're expected to. Eleanor worked tirelessly to help people understand what their roles here in the church are and to help us all embrace how important our involvement and attention are to what our church does and how it operates in our community. Central to UCC polity is the belief that it is our local church that's best able to discern what God is calling us to do and be in this place and at this time. I think the first church board meeting I was on that was led by Eleanor was the Board of Trustees. At the first meeting, she announced that our job was to take care of the church property, raise the annual budget, and be in charge of the financial and business affairs of the church. Then she succinctly outlined what our major challenges would be for that year. So there was no question what we were doing there and that we had an important job. But then she did something else. She asked if anyone else had issues that they believed the board should address in the coming year as the Board of Trustees. Everyone had an important role to play, and Eleanor not only welcomed it, but expected it. And fourth, Eleanor had a strong faith in the presence of the Spirit in this entire process. On one board we served on together, I had gotten wind of a plan to bring up a vote to fire a church employee at the next meeting. As I would do in business, in a case like this, I called Eleanor to discuss it and asked her, what are we going to do to head off this vote? She said something that struck me as remarkable at the time. She said, well, you know, I think when we convene as a group with good information and positive intentions, the Holy Spirit has a role to play. And that's really the point, so let's just see how it goes. We discussed the motion and agreed not to fire the staff member. So, figuring out how to be an independent woman, loving and respectful, but also worthy of love and respect, for me boils down to two things. Not because there really are only two things, but that's the most I can keep in my head at one time. Those two things are courage and grace. Courage and grace have become a mantra for me for most of my professional life. And maybe that's how we get from wives obey your husbands to today's epistle lesson that Barb and Grant read, God is love. Frederick Buechner, one of my favorite theologians, says, to say that love is God is romantic idealism. To say that God is love is either the last straw or the ultimate truth. In the Christian sense, love is not primarily an emotion, but an act of will. When Jesus tells us to love our neighbors, he is not telling us to love them in the sense of responding to them with a cozy emotional feeling. You can as easily produce a yawn or a sneeze on demand. On the contrary, he's telling us to love our neighbors in the sense of being willing to work for their well-being, even if it means sacrificing our own well-being to that end, even if it means sometimes just leaving them alone. Thus, in Jesus' terms, we can love our neighbors without necessarily liking them. It's this kind of love that I think overcomes the blind and sweeping assertions that prescribe roles and limit participation, that slippery slope of silencing that Rebecca Solnit talks about. A very long time ago, I picked up Jessamine West's book, The Life I Really Lived, which is said by some to be a thinly veiled autobiography, in which the lead character goes through some horrific events while maintaining an image of a successful and positive novelist. The book ends, as I will today, with the main character saying, after all the pain and stupidity and cruelty in my life, I found that love sanctifies. Love sanctifies all the messy human relationships, all the missed opportunities, all the stupid, thoughtless comments, and the overreactions to them. Despite our best intentions, our striving to be courageous and gracious, we will mess up. And when we do, it's nice to remember that love sanctifies.